When we hear the word Rome, our minds immediately conjure images of marble columns, gladiator battles in the Colosseum, and legions marching under the banner of the eagle. But the story of Rome is not a single narrative. It is a massive, sprawling saga that outlived its own capital, split into two, and eventually inspired a completely different empire centuries later. Today, we are going to untangle one of the most fascinating webs in European history. We will explore the three distinct entities that claimed the mantle of Rome: the Western Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, often called the Byzantine Empire, and the Holy Roman Empire. By the end of this journey, you will understand how a single ancient city shaped the political, religious, and cultural destiny of the Western world for nearly 2 millennia. Part 1. The Western Roman Empire, the Anatomy of a Collapse. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our detailed exploration of the Western Roman Empire. To the citizens of the Mediterranean world during the height of the Pax Romana in the 2nd century AD, the concept of Rome falling was literally unimaginable. Rome was not merely a state, it was Roma Aeterna, the eternal city. It was the unquestioned center of political gravity, economic wealth, and military dominance across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Yet, by 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire had ceased to exist. Its territory was carved up by Germanic warlords, its treasury was empty, its cities were shrinking, and its last emperor was a teenage boy quietly forced into retirement. How does a global superpower that endured for centuries simply dissolve? The fall of Western Rome was not caused by a single battle or a single incompetent ruler. It was a centuries-long process of systemic breakdown, a lethal confluence of economic collapse, military reliance on foreign mercenaries, geopolitical vulnerability, and catastrophic refugee crises. Today, we are going to perform a detailed autopsy on the giant that fell. Section 1. The Seeds of Decay. The Crisis of the 3rd Century, 235 to 284 AD. To understand why the West fell in the 5th century, we must first go back 200 years to the crisis of the 3rd century. This 50-year catastrophe nearly destroyed the Roman Empire 2 centuries ahead of schedule. The 3rd century crisis, 235 to 284 AD. 1. Military anarchy and the barracks emperors. In 235 AD, Emperor Severus Alexander was murdered by his own troops. This kicked off 50 years of relentless civil war. Between 235 and 284 AD, over 26 men were recognized as emperor by the Roman Senate, with dozens of additional usurpers claiming local power. Most of these men were barracks emperors, military commanders elevated to the throne by their legions after promising massive pay raises, only to be assassinated by those same soldiers a few months or years later when the money ran out or a rival general offered more. This constant internal fighting brought the empire to its knees. Territorial fragmentation. The empire broke into 3 competing states: the breakaway Gallic Empire in the west, Gaul, Britannia, and Hispania; the Palmyrene Empire in the east, Syria, Egypt, and Levant; and the Rump Roman state in Italy. Neglected borders. While Roman legions were slaughtering each other to put their generals on the throne, Germanic tribes, Goths, Alemanni, and Franks breached the northern frontiers with impunity. 2. Hyperinflation and economic collapse. To fund the constant civil wars and bribe soldiers for their loyalty, emperors engaged in aggressive monetary debasement. The standard silver coin of the empire, the denarius, had maintained a silver purity of over 90% during the reign of Augustus. By the 270s AD, emperors had melted down so much silver and mixed it with cheap copper that the coin contained less than 0.5% pure silver. The economic consequences were devastating. Prices soared, creating staggering hyperinflation across the empire. Merchants lost all trust in Roman imperial coinage, causing long-distance trade to collapse. The economy retreated toward a primitive system of barter, local self-sufficiency, and feudal agrarianism. Though brilliant warrior emperors like Aurelian reigned 270 to 275 AD, who defeated the breakaway regimes and earned the title Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. Reunified the empire by sheer force of will, the structural foundation of the Roman state had been permanently fractured. Section 2. The Radical Cure, Diocletian and the Divided Empire. In 284 AD, an illiterate Illyrian soldier named Diocletian seized power. Diocletian was an administrative genius who understood a fundamental geographic truth. The Roman Empire had become too vast, its borders too long, and its domestic problems too complex for one man, sitting in Rome to rule effectively. The Tetrarchy, 293 AD. Diocletian established the Tetrarchy, rule of four. The empire was divided into two administrative halves, the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. Each half was ruled by a senior emperor called an Augustus, assisted by a junior emperor and successor called Caesar. Diocletian also abandoned the city of Rome as an administrative capital. He moved his court to Nicomedia in Asia Minor, while his Western co-emperor Maximian established his headquarters in Milan and later Trier. Rome remained the symbolic and spiritual heartland, but it was no longer the political engine of the empire. The Edict on Maximum Prices, 301 AD. To curb rampant inflation, Diocletian issued the famous Edict on Maximum Prices, setting strict price ceilings on over 1,000 goods and services, from wheat and wine to boots and the daily wages of carpenter, on pain of death. While the edict largely failed, creating massive black markets, it demonstrated the total authoritarian control the late Roman government sought to exert over its citizens. The Roman state was no longer a republic or a principate. It had transformed into an autocracy known as the Dominate. The permanent split, 395 AD. Though Constantine the Great reigned 306 to 337 AD, temporarily reunited the empire, moved the imperial capital to Constantinople, and legalized Christianity, the structural division between East and West was deep-seated. When Emperor Theodosius I died in 395 AD, he permanently divided the empire between his two young sons. Arcadius received the wealthy, stable East. Honorius received the impoverished, vulnerable West. From 395 AD onward, the Western and Eastern have never ruled as a unified nation again. Section 3. The Internal Rot, Structural Vulnerabilities of the West. Why did the Eastern Roman Empire survive for another 1,000 years while the West collapsed within 8 decades of the permanent split? The answer lies in the stark structural disparities between the two halves. 1. Border geography and military exposure. The West was burdened with thousands of miles of exposed, terrestrial borders along the Rhine and Danube rivers. Beyond these rivers lay the vast European wilderness, inhabited by dozens of warrior tribes in continuous migration. The East, by contrast, had shorter land borders, natural maritime buffers, the Black Sea and Mediterranean, and the legendary defensive walls of Constantinople guarding its heartland. 2. Economic disparity and tax evasion. The Eastern economy was urbanized, cash-rich, and deeply integrated into international trade routes with Asia and Africa. The Western economy was overwhelmingly agrarian, controlled by a small class of immensely wealthy aristocratic landowners called patricians. These patricians lived in fortified rural estates, latifundia, and used their political influence to systematically evade paying imperial taxes. As a result, the burden of funding the army fell onto the rural middle class and peasantry. Tax collectors extracted wealth so ruthlessly that many Roman peasants fled into the forests or voluntarily surrendered their freedom to wealthy landlords in exchange for protection, laying the structural groundwork for medieval serfdom. 3. The barbarization of the legions. In the early days of the Republican Principate, Roman legions were composed of free Roman citizens fighting for land, civic pride, and glory. By the 4th century, Italian citizens almost entirely avoided military service. Rich men routinely cut off their own thumbs to disqualify themselves from the draft. Desperate for soldiers, the Western government began hiring entire Germanic tribes as foederati, federates/allies. Parameter. Classical Roman legion, 1st century. Late Western army, 5th century. Recruitment, free Roman citizens. Germanic foederati, mercenaries. Loyalty, to Rome/the emperor. To their tribal chieftain/warlord. Tactics, disciplined infantry cohorts. Heavy cavalry and tribal warbands. Leadership, Roman senatorial/equestrian class. Germanic generals, Stilicho, Ricimer. By 400 AD, the Western Roman army was Roman in name only. It was commanded by Germanic warlords, men like Stilicho, a Vandal, Ricimer, a Suebian/Visigoth, and Odoacer, a Syrian. These men were the real power behind the throne, creating and executing puppet emperors at will. Section 4. The domino effect, the Great Migrations. The immediate catalyst for the collapse of the West was not an internal revolution, but an ecological and military crisis thousands of miles away in Central Asia. The sudden westward expansion of the Huns. The Huns and the refugee crisis. The Huns were nomadic horseback warriors of unmatched mobility and ferocity. As they swept across the Eurasian steppes, they crushed every tribe in their path. Terrified by the Hunnic advance, the Visigoths, Western Goths, fled to the northern bank of the Danube River in 376 AD, begging the Eastern Emperor Valens for asylum within the Roman Empire. Valens agreed, seeing the Goths as potential tax revenue and agricultural labor. However, corrupt Roman border officials starved the refugees, charging them exorbitant prices for dog meat and forcing Gothic families to sell their children into slavery to survive. Driven to absolute desperation, the Goths rebelled. The Battle of Adrianople, 378 AD. On August 9, 378 AD, Emperor Valens marched his army to crush the Goths near Adrianople, modern-day Edirne, Turkey. Valens refused to wait for reinforcements from his Western nephew, Emperor Gratian, wanting all the glory for himself. It was a fatal mistake. The Gothic heavy cavalry unexpectedly returned to the battlefield, encircled the exhausted Roman infantry, and slaughtered them. 2/3 of the Eastern Roman field army was wiped out, and Emperor Valens himself was killed, his body never found. Adrianople was the worst defeat suffered by Rome since Hannibal destroyed its legions at Cannae in 216 BC. It proved to the world that Roman armies were no longer invincible. The crossing of the Rhine, 406 AD. To defend Italy against Gothic incursions, the Western military commander Stilicho was forced to strip troops from the northern Rhine frontier in Britain. In the bitterly cold winter of December 406 AD, the Rhine River froze solid near modern-day Mainz. A massive coalition of Germanic tribes, including the Vandals, Alans, Suebi, and Burgundians, walked across the frozen river in their tens of thousands, bypassing Roman frontier defenses completely. The imperial government in the West had lost control of Gaul and Hispania overnight. Section 5. The Death Blows, the Cascade of Collapse, 410 to 476 AD. The final 7 decades of the Western Roman Empire were an agonizing sequence of sacks, territorial losses, and political assassinations. The first sack of Rome, 410 AD. Alaric and the Visigoths breached the Salarian Gate, looting the city of Rome for 3 days. The fall of Carthage, 439 AD. The Vandals captured North Africa, cutting off Rome's primary grain supply and tax revenue. Battle of the Catalonian Plains, 451 AD. Flavius Aetius forms an alliance with the Visigoths to halt Attila, the Hun in Gaul. The second sack of Rome, 455 AD. Gaiseric and the Vandals systematically plunder Rome for 2 weeks, stripping its buildings of metals and jewels. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus, 476 AD. Odoacer deposes the last Western Roman emperor, marking the official end of the Western Empire. 1. The sack of Rome by Alaric, 410 AD. In 410 AD, Alaric I, king of the Visigoths, marched on Rome. Alaric was not a barbarian savage. He was a former Roman auxiliary officer who wanted land, food supplies for his people, and an official Roman military title. The Western Emperor Honorius, a cowardly man whose reign was defined by incompetence, refused to negotiate, hiding behind the impenetrable swamps of his fortress capital in Ravenna. Alaric placed Rome under siege until the starving citizens opened the Salarian Gate on August 24th, 410 AD. The Visigoths looted the city for 3 days. While the physical damage was moderate compared to later sacks, the psychological impact was profound. St. Augustine wrote his monumental philosophical work, The City of God, to explain to horrified Christians why God had allowed the eternal city to fall to pagans and heretics. 2. The loss of North Africa, the economic death sentence for 39 AD. While the sack of 410 AD hit Rome's pride, the loss of North Africa hit Rome's heart. Led by their brilliant, limping King Gaiseric, the Vandals crossed from Spain into North Africa in 429 AD. By 439 AD, they had captured the rich metropolis of Carthage. This single conquest sealed the fate of the Western Empire. Grain supply cut off. North Africa was the agricultural breadbasket of the West. Without Egyptian or North African grain, the city of Rome could no longer feed its population. Total financial bankruptcy. North Africa provided over 80% of the Western imperial court's remaining tax revenue. Without this cash, the empire could no longer afford to pay its armies or hire mercenaries. Piracy in the Mediterranean. Gaiseric built a formidable Vandal fleet in Carthage, transforming the Western Mediterranean from a Roman highway into a pirate-infested danger zone. 3. Attila the Hun and the last great Roman general, 451 AD. In the 440s, the Huns found a unified leader in Attila, known to contemporaries as the Scourge of God. After extorting massive amounts of gold from the Eastern Roman Empire, Attila turned his attention to the West. The last true military genius of the West, General Flavius Aetius, who had spent his youth as a hostage among the Huns and understood their tactics, accomplished the impossible. He forged a grand coalition army composed of Romans, Visigoths, Franks, and Burgundians. On June 20th, 451 AD, at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, near modern Chalons, France, Aetius defeated Attila in a bloody combat. It was the last great victory of a Roman army in the West. However, the victory was short-lived. In 454 AD, the paranoid Western Emperor Valentinian III grew jealous of Aetius' popularity and murdered the general with his own hands during a court meeting. A courtier famously remarked to the emperor, "Sire, you have cut off your right hand with your left." A year later, Valentinian III was assassinated by Aetius' loyal bodyguards. 4. 476 AD, the quiet extinction. By the 470s, the Western Empire was a hollow shell. Italy was governed by a series of short-lived puppet emperors controlled by the Germanic military leader Ricimer. In 475 AD, a general named Orestes drove out the reigning emperor and placed his own 12-year-old son on the throne. The boy was named Romulus Augustus, ironically combining the names of the founder of Rome, Romulus, and its first emperor, Augustus. Contemporaries mockingly called him Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus. Romulus ruled for less than a year. In August 476 AD, the Germanic mercenaries in Italy demanded 1/3 of all Italian lands to settle. When Orestes refused, a chieftain named Odoacer led a mutiny, executed Orestes, and marched on Ravenna. On September 4th, 476 AD, Odoacer forced the young Romulus Augustulus to abdicate. Instead of naming a new puppet emperor or claiming the imperial title for himself, Odoacer did something unprecedented. He spared the boy's life, granting him a pension and an estate in Campania. He gathered the imperial regalia, the purple cloak, the golden diadem, and the scepter, packed them into a box, and sent them to the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno in Constantinople. Odoacer sent an accompanying letter stating that Western Europe no longer required an emperor. One emperor in Constantinople was enough for both halves. Odoacer then declared himself Rex Italiae, King of Italy. The Western Roman Empire was officially over. Section 6. Legacy and historiography. Did Rome fall or transform? For centuries, historians debated the exact cause of the fall of Rome. In his masterpiece, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, 1776, British historian Edward Gibbon famously blamed two primary factors: the loss of civic virtue among Roman citizens and the rise of Christianity, which he argued sapped the empire's martial spirit. Modern historians, however, view the event through a far more nuanced lens. Transformation versus cataclysm. Did Rome fall in a violent apocalypse, or did it merely transform into something new? The cataclysm view, Brian Ward Perkins, focuses on the real loss of material civilization. Following 476 AD, pottery production, literacy, coin usage, building techniques, and population levels in Western Europe collapsed to prehistoric levels. The transformation view, Peter Brown/Late Antiquity, argues that Roman culture did not die. It merged with Germanic culture. Germanic kings like Theodoric the Great retained Roman law, employed Roman administrators, and preserved Roman architecture. The institutional ghost. The ultimate irony of the fall of Western Rome is that its institutional ghost continued to rule Europe. The Roman Catholic Church. The Church stepped into the administrative vacuum left by the collapse of the Western Court. Bishops took over civil administration in cities, and the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, assumed the ancient Roman imperial title of Pontifex Maximus. Language. Latin survived as the language of scholarship, religion, and law throughout the Middle Ages, evolving into the modern Romance languages spoken by over 1 billion people today. Law. The legal codes of Rome formed the structural bedrock for modern Western jurisprudence and civil rights. The Western Roman Empire fell, but the idea of Rome proved indestructible. It set the stage for our next chapter, the survivor in the East, the Byzantine Empire, which kept the Roman torch burning for another 1,000 years.